And with that, it is noon. So let's go ahead and kick things off. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar, Say This, Not That. I'm Kayla Kovac-Galton, the Curriculum and Project Strategist at the Diversity Movement. Today, we have our Head of Content and Programming, Jackie Ferguson, joined by Bernadette Smith. Bernadette is CEO of Equality Institute, whose mission is to help organizations win bigger by treating workers and clients with dignity and respect. Bernadette has been featured on The Today Show, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, and National Public Radio. She is a nationally recognized keynote speaker, thought leader, and consultant, and an award-winning author of 3 books, with her 4th book, Unassuming Assumptions, scheduled for release later this year. Again, this webinar is Say This, Not That, which explores inclusive language and some of the language mistakes that are commonly made that exclude, marginalize, or alienate people. So let's start off with a quick poll to see how many of these non-inclusive terms you might have used. All right, I see some responses coming in.
Well, I'm a panelist and I can't vote, but I can tell you that I have done all of those things.
Same here, exactly.
That's right.
Perfect, keep it in, coming. Give it a few more seconds for people to enter their responses. All right, great, and I will show you all the results. So good percentage all across the board. Many people like the 3 of us, all the above.
Sorry.
Well, thank you for sharing that. This discussion will be full of tips to get you on the right track with inclusive language. During this hour, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time, and we'll try to answer as many live as we can. If you're referencing this webinar on social media, please use the hashtag TDMWebinar and tag us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Now I'm going to drop out of sight and let our host take it from here. Jackie, the mic is yours.
Kayla, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for this important conversation about inclusive language. As Kayla said, I'm so fortunate to have Bernadette Smith with me today. Bernadette, welcome.
Thank you. It's really great to connect with you again, Jackie. Jackie and I are from the same part of the country. We're from the Hudson Valley in New York, so that's one of the ways we've bonded over the past few months.
Absolutely. A quick note for everyone before we begin. Conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially those that require us to be vulnerable, can also make us feel uncomfortable. And we want to allow compassionate and critical dialogues that lead to personal exploration and growth. If we're not comfortable being uncomfortable in these conversations, we aren't doing it right. So Bernadette, let's jump in and talk about the definition of inclusive language. To me, it means naming, honoring, and valuing individuals, their identities, and experiences. What's your definition? And for those on the webinar, you can add your definition into the chat as well. Thanks, Bernadette.
Using inclusive language is about being deliberate about not excluding people in your word choice, and it requires a lot of conscious effort. It's not because word choices are so deeply ingrained in everything we do and have been for decades. Everything we say, it's requires a level of consciousness to change your default, but without even realizing it, we accidentally exclude folks all the time, or we accidentally offend folks all the time, simply by not being more intentional about our word choice.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for that, Bernadette. And I see that some people are adding notes into the chat. Please continue to do so as we proceed. The next question, Bernadette, that I want to talk about are, what are some of the benefits of using inclusive language?
Well, if you think about the macro benefits of using inclusive language, it could be anything from being more inclusive of your diverse customers or your diverse clients and not accidentally offending the people that you're trying to sell to, right? So that's a pretty big benefit. And also the same thing about your coworkers and your team and your employees. If you use inclusive language as you're interacting with the members of your team and within your organization, you are more likely to avoid macroaggressions. You're more likely to avoid accidentally offending someone, and your team members are likelier to stick around a little bit longer. And we all know about how important it is to maintain employee retention and to create workplaces where everyone feels like they can be themselves. And if our language at work is not inclusive, then we are sending a signal to folks that they are the other, that they are on the outside, and that sends them a signal that they should hide parts of who they are at work. They should cover up. And then, that's sort of a whole rabbit hole of, lack of retention. So it can be really a big problem. I mean, that's just on the work side. Using inclusive language around your teenage kids is pretty important too, because they will call you out.
Right. That's exactly right. Yeah, it's so important for relationships. It's so important in the workplace. Bernadette, I want to take a moment and offer some definitions. So you said the word macroaggressions, and I know that the word microaggressions is another word that's circulating in the space. Can you take a moment to talk about what those words mean?
Oh, you know what? I thought I said microaggressions. I said taking a macro approach on the perspective is, thinking about clients and customers. The microaggressions are those subtle acts of exclusion that we use, mostly accidentally, sometimes intentionally, to exclude others. And they could be sort of backhanded compliments. They could be deliberately choosing to using exclusive language because we deliberately want to exclude folks. But these microaggressions, so if I said macroaggressions before, I apologize. Microaggressions are, they're slight. And sometimes folks who are marginalized, they might dismiss them, they might just let them go. But over time, they build up. Yeah. And it's sort of that theory of death by 1,000 little cuts, right? Over time, those little microaggressions can really compound, and they can make folks feel unsafe at work. And when your workforce, when your workplace does not have this sense of psychological safety, does not have a culture of psychological safety, you're in trouble, because that means that folks are not, first of all, they're not showing up authentically, which also means that they're not sharing their best ideas, right? If they don't feel safe because of microaggressions in your workplace, they don't feel safe to just be themselves, then they're probably not going to feel safe to trust you with their ideas, with their innovative ideas that could really move the organization forward. They might not feel safe to speak up if they see an act of exclusion that the organization is doing. So microaggressions can be insidious.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And Bernadette, while we're on the topic of microaggressions, what do we do if we hear a microaggression or experience that around us? As allies, what can we do?
That's a great question. One of the tools that I provide folks in training, so I'll talk about this today, is called the ARC method. And the ARC method stands for Ask, Respect, Connect. And my theory is that we can solve most problems by asking better questions. And so in the case of a microaggression, you can actually use the ARC method, whether you're a victim of a microaggression or whether you are a witness to a microaggression and you want to be an ally, start by asking a question. And that question can be something like, did you say what I thought you said? Or what did you mean when you said that? Or it could be something like, can you explain what you meant? Can you tell me what you meant by that's so gay, right? Some people could say that that's so gay, that phrase is a microaggression. Some people think it's more than that. But I think most times when there's that type of comment, it's not intended to be hurtful. They're seeing gay as a euphemism for like strange, right? So, you know, I think that using the ARC method is a really great way to gently call people out. And how gentle you are depends on the context. Mm-hmm. So the question that you use to start the ARC method should come from a place of curiosity, not confrontation. You should start by taking a deep breath, because this could, you know, you are essentially being confrontational. You're just reframing it so it becomes a little bit more gentle. So yeah, so saying something like, can you tell me what you meant by that? Can you explain it? You know, and just asking that question from a place of curiosity is really powerful. So that's the A. And then R stands for respect. And that means that as the person who asked the question, listen, connect. Listen and connect with empathy as the person is perhaps then explaining themselves or defending themselves. You know, listen. And then the C stands for connect. And by that, I mean paraphrase, validate, perhaps move on, but move on. It doesn't need to turn into this, you know, clash, right? If you follow the ARC method correctly, you can diffuse the situation pretty quickly. And a lot of times people they don't know that what they're saying is offensive, right? And so coming from a place of curiosity can help people realize that what they're saying might not be appropriate for the workplace, or that what they're saying can trigger some folks, right? They might not realize that, especially if they have a lot of advantages and they're not used to being the other.
Absolutely. Bernadette, thank you so much for sharing those amazing strategies that we can all use in our everyday lives to be allies and to combat those microaggressions that are, you know, unfortunately prevalent in our environment. So thank you for that.
No problem. I'm actually going to put a link in the chat. There's a PDF we have of the ARC method, so you can download it as a sort of a cheat sheet. It has conversation starters, so you can sort of see how to use it. You can use it for anytime you need clarity. So whether you are trying to understand someone's situation, whether you are trying to understand someone's pronouns, you can use the ARC method, right? You can ask someone a question about their pronouns using the ARC method. You can use the ARC method to make business decisions and to get the right to help you prioritize what your business decisions are. You can use the ARC method, because if you have a great framework and then you actually listen to the answers you receive, then you can be incredibly successful with actually moving the needle. But a lot of times we're just afraid of asking the questions, and instead we make assumptions. Okay. And that's sort of the whole concept of the ARC method, is we're too busy making assumptions to ask the right question, because we're afraid of the right question because we don't know how to ask. So the cheat sheet for the ARC method has a lot of conversation starters. So whether you're using it as a way to gently call someone out, or whether you're using it as a framework to make organizational decisions, it can be incredibly powerful.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that. In my signatures and on my LinkedIn, I use my pronouns, she and her. So you mentioned pronouns. Why do we see pronouns in signatures, Bernadette, or sometimes hear them in introductions? Great.
As you may notice, I added my pronouns to my Zoom name. It's a great question, and thank you for asking it. It's really important. The reality is that 31% of Gen Z and 20% of millennials identify as LGBTQ+, and about a third of those know someone who identifies as transgender or non-binary or uses the singular pronoun they. And here's the thing, is that it's not just straight or gay, it's not just male or female. That's it. Like there's a whole spectrum of gender and there's a whole spectrum of sexuality, right? There's, we all know bisexual, but there's more than that, right? And we all know male or female, but there's more than that. Some people are in between male and female. Some people are neither male nor female. Some people were born with and assigned a male at birth, but later as they start to mature, they realize that they are actually a female inside their head. And so they transition. And so because there's this whole spectrum of gender and there's this whole spectrum of sexuality, we need to realize it's beyond the binary. It's beyond the he or the she, right? And so for folks who identify as a gender identity that is perhaps both male and female or neither male nor female, those folks may identify as non-binary. And the pronoun that they might use is they. But contrary to what we might think, and this goes along to making assumptions, we can't assume someone's gender just by looking at them, right? Because everyone is on their own gender journey, on their own journey for gender expression, even how they are choosing to express their gender. That's a journey too, right? Okay. And the process of transitioning from one gender to another, if there are medical transitions, I mean, it is a big, long, expensive process, and not everyone has those privileges to be able to have insurance pay for those procedures. So as a result, someone's gender might be different from what we'd expect. And we might make assumptions all the time about someone's gender. And because of that, we should ask better questions. And so instead of asking someone, hey, what's your gender? We can start by actually sharing our pronouns so someone feels safe to share their own.
Absolutely.
Right? So to truly create inclusive spaces, we should share our pronouns to open up the space for folks who are more marginalized because of their gender identity to share their own. I live in a village 10 miles west of Chicago now, and right in my little village, it's like 7,000 or 8,000 people in my village, and there's a neighborhood grocery store 3 blocks from here, and there's a new employee in the grocery store who's clearly who's in some form of transition, whatever that happens to be, medical or social, whatever form of gender transition. And that employee now wears he, him name badge in this little grocery store. Like it's very cool. I'm like, yeah, go Ed's way, It's pretty cool. But you'll see that at T-Mobile stores, at Starbucks, at Target, you'll see some employees who have pronouns on their name badges. You'll see plenty of folks having pronouns on their LinkedIn, certainly in their email signatures. As we start meetings now, some folks are going around and they're sharing their pronouns, or that's become a meeting norm, just to establish a default that you are safe here, regardless of how you choose to identify, you are safe here. But it does require us as allies and aspiring allies to create that space, and which might mean a little bit of vulnerability.
That's right. And Bernadette, since this is the Say This, Not That webinar, can we talk about the term preferred pronouns and why that's wrong?
Sure. Well, I sort of see preferred pronouns as akin to sexual preference. So we're going to also say, do not say sexual preference. So say sexual orientation or sexuality, not sexual preference. And say pronouns, not preferred pronouns. And it's because of the word prefer. Because prefer implies that it's a choice. And I can tell you right now, I did not choose to be gay. I love being gay, but it wasn't a choice. I don't prefer it. Well, I probably do prefer it. I don't know. I don't really know the alternative, but I can say that it's not my preference, right? It's not like conscious. It's just who I am. And so pronouns are just who you are, not something you prefer. It's just who you are. I see a question coming up in the chat, Jackie, if you don't mind, regarding the use of they.
Absolutely.
So the history and use of they. So first of all, we use the singular pronoun they to represent one person. We use it all the time without even realizing it. So for example, let's just say we had an in-person meeting, right? And someone left their water bottle in the conference room. What do we say? Oh, someone left their water bottle. I don't know whether the owner of the water bottle is a he or a she, right? We say someone left their water bottle. We do it all the time. So the fact is that we've been doing this for decades. Also, you know, companies are doing this. Like, for example, when I open the Lyft app and I'm waiting for my driver to come, the Lyft app says, your driver so-and-so is here. Look for them in the black Toyota Camry, right? So they're saying they, look for them. So, you know, even systems are set up like that. LinkedIn, so-and-so is having a birthday, wish them a happy birthday, right? So we use the singular they constantly. And I understand grammar police, it's really hard. It's really hard for me to initially wrap my head around using the singular they. I have a niece who came out as non-binary. And so, you know, and I've been gay for, you know, out as gay for over 20 years, but this concept of non-binary and even transgender, they're relatively new concepts in our culture, not around the world. That's old news around the world. But in our culture, they're relatively new concepts. And so we are, you know, so it was, you know, I just felt when my niece came out as non-binary, I just felt like a boring suburban lesbian, like, you know, I have to get used to that, right? And I do this kind of work for a living. So I understand that it takes a while for folks to wrap their head around that. One way you can intellectualize it, if you'd like to intellectualize it, is to think about folks who might use the singular pronoun they as both male and female. So when you think of both, you know, both is plural. So if you need to intellectualize it, think of them as both male and female, and then maybe you can get a handle on it. How about let's all, I don't care who's around you, I don't care, you know, whether there's dogs, remote learning, no one. How about we all do this practice? Will you practice with me, Jackie?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, repeat after me. Hi, my name is Bernadette.
My name is Jackie.
My pronouns are she and her.
My pronouns are she and her.
What are your pronouns?
What are your pronouns?
Hey, you did it.
That's right.
I know it sounds simplistic, but that's it. That's all we got to do is say we introduce ourselves with our pronouns simply to create that vulnerability and kind of normalize this. And then it just changes everything. There's a few other questions in the chat. We can address it at any point.
Yes, let's go ahead and hit the one about the percentages of the LGBTQ plus identifying folks in the Gen Z and millennial generations that you mentioned earlier.
Sure. There was a study that came out in I think it was last year, 2019, from Kantar and Hornet, and it said that Kantar is a big consulting firm. They discovered that 20% of millennials are identifying as LGBTQ plus, so somewhere in that spectrum, the LGBTQ plus spectrum. So they're essentially identifying as not exclusively straight and not exclusively male or female. So 20% of millennials and 31% of Gen Z, so almost a third of Gen Z are identifying as not exclusively straight and not exclusively male or female. Now I'm Gen X, so we're a mere 10%. So again, you know, I feel like a boring suburban lesbian, but you know, that in my generation, like 1 in 10, and that's how when I came out, that's what I was taught, 1 in 10. Now it would have been much easier to date if it was 1 in 3, but back then. But yeah, we're seeing more and more folks, younger folks in particular, feeling safe to identify this way, getting permission to identify this way, because we are having conversations that it's beyond the binary, it's beyond the two choices of male or female, straight or gay.
Perfect. Bernadette mentioned earlier in the conversation that she and I are from the same small town in the Hudson Valley of New York. We even hung out at the very same mall, albeit probably apart. I'm a smidge older, or a little bit more than that.
You look great, however old you are.
Oh, thanks. I want to start with a hometown favorite, and it was also in the poll, guys, right? Mm-hmm. Bernadette, tell us why this is not inclusive.
Hey guys, yeah, I grew up in the so in the Hudson Valley and in New York, and I think even in the Midwest, here in Chicago, people say "hey guys" all the time as well. And you know, the thing is about guys is that it's gendered. Mm-hmm. We use it as a catch-all, but it's gendered. We do. And so the best practice here is actually to move away from any kind of gendered greetings. And so that means to ditch the sir, ditch the ma'am, ditch the hey ladies, hey gentlemen, ditch the good afternoon ladies and gentlemen, you know, hey girls and boys, ditch all of it, right? And so those are all gendered greetings. But instead we can say, hey everyone, hey friends, my favorite is folks. Yes, those of you who are in the South, y'all is perfect. Y'all, exactly. Y'all is for all. That's right. I think it's a great gender inclusive greeting. So rock the y'all, get rid of the guys. But my approach has definitely been folks. And I get some pushback on folks that, like, I don't know, they might think it's not professional or whatever, but I try to use folks a lot.
Another inclusive term is yins. If you know in the chat where that's from, what city is yins from? But that's another, there we go, Pittsburgh.
That's new to me.
That's inclusive. That's an inclusive one. Awesome.
Wow, yins.
I had to shout out, both of my parents are from Pittsburgh, so I just had to shout out that inclusive term there before we move on to the next thing.
That's awesome. Yeah, I don't know that one. I'm gonna have to add that to my book.
Awesome. All right, awesome. Another word that we never want to say is normal, right? Who remembers the ad from a popular skincare brand that said normal to dark skin? If you know that brand, comment in the chat. We're also going to be doing an upcoming webinar on multicultural marketing with Walk West. That might get a little cringy with some of the non-inclusive terms and the, you know, non-inclusive information that's in those ads. But if anyone, okay, so nope, there we go, Dove. That's right, it was Dove. Mm-hmm. Great, awesome. So
I didn't know that, Jackie.
Yeah.
And Dove has done so much in recent years to showcase their inclusivity. So is it like an extreme reaction to any flack they may have caught in the past?
Yeah, they've had a couple of major flubs that they caught some flack for. So it wasn't just one. But fortunately, I think they've, created some level of diversity and inclusivity in their final reviews, and they're doing a much better job, which is great.
That is great. I mean, their marketing is certainly very inclusive. Mm-hmm. At least the ads they've done recently. Wow.
Yeah, so let's talk about the word normal. Very often people say this word, but why does it make people feel othered?
It makes people feel othered because it establishes a default, right? And the default is typically, cisgender, heterosexual, white, able-bodied, right? And if you're not part of the default, then, or the normal, then you're othered.
That's right.
Right? It sets the standard.
That's right. And Bernadette, often the concept of inclusive language is approached from a leadership perspective, but it's equally important to your brand that your frontline employees have this competency when interacting with customers and clients. Bernadette, I know you're passionate about this topic and often speak on it as well. Can we talk about the value of equipping your frontline employees with inclusive language?
Yeah, I see a little bit of this in the chat, and this sort of follows up with the hey guys, right? It's because a lot of times it's frontline workers who do have greetings like that, and greetings are incredibly powerful. There are some folks in the chat who've asked about sir and ma'am, and sort of the standard for hotels has always been good afternoon, sir, good afternoon, ma'am, how can I help you, right? Or any sort of, even banks and other sort of professional environments. It's very typical. But the simple solution is just to not say sir or ma'am. You can be really kind. You can be very warm, very welcoming, simply by saying, good afternoon. How can I help you? Right? You don't need the gendered greeting of sir or ma'am. But the best practice truly is setting up the systems so that you're giving your customers and your clients the option to self-identify. So that means changing the database, the setup, the forms. So for example, in the case of a bank, and there are some banks that have done this, you can add, first of all, some banks offer more than the typical honorifics, more than just Mr., Mrs., right? There are some banks that now offer M and mix, gender neutral honorifics. So that's the first one. The second one is anytime your organization is collecting gender. So unless it's for human resources, if it's human resources, you get two choices. But if there's any other reason your organization is asking someone their gender, ask, first of all, why are we asking someone their gender? And if it's not for federal forms, then add a third gender option. Okay? So you want to have a third gender option. It could just say other, and someone can self-identify. You also want to change your forms to offer a pronoun option. So if you change your forms to say, pronouns, and people can check he or she, or he, they can check he or him, they can check she or her, they or them, or other. If you update your systems and you have that information about your customers in your systems because you've been proactive about collecting it, you can then be more inclusive. So for example, in your hotel profile, you might be able to, some of the hotels allow you to provide a preferred name. And yes, it's a preferred name, because your name that might be on your ID might be a name that you no longer use because your ID and your gender marker have not yet been updated, because it's really hard for a transgender person to update their ID and their gender marker. So the name that might be in the system might be a name that they don't use. It might be their dead name. And so when we give folks the option to provide their pronoun, their gender, especially if there's a third gender option, and also an like another name, their preferred name, then we're giving folks the sense they're telling us how we can be inclusive of them, and so that we can then provide better customer service. So when I'm doing a training for frontline employees, I'm not just saying, hey, stop saying sir and ma'am, stop saying hey guys. I'm also talking about what are the policies we can change on the back end that create a more inclusive customer experience and also reduce the risk of your frontline employees accidentally offending someone.
Thanks, Bernadette. That's so helpful. I'm seeing in the chat, someone mentioned the DJ forms for wedding had bride and groom. Bernadette, what do you know about wedding planning? And let's talk about that.
Samantha, I know a thing or two about wedding planning. I've actually written 3 books on same-sex weddings. I used to be a wedding planner. I'm retired now, but my whole business was built around helping the wedding industry become inclusive of LGBTQ couples, inclusive of the diversity of the community. And a big thing we focused on, again, was the forms. So updating the forms to be inclusive. And then, of course, helping folks understand how to use more inclusive language. Right, so that's incredibly important. And I'm so sorry that happened to you on your DJ form. I have heard from other couples whose DJ messed up on their wedding day because their DJs are just programmed. Like they, if they're working 40, 50 weddings a year and 98% of them are cisgender straight couples, they just get in their routine. Right. And so, yeah, I'd like to welcome the bride and the groom to the dance floor. So that has happened as well in person at someone's wedding, which is just horrible. So I'm sorry that was your experience on forums. I hope that there was no actual discrimination besides the exclusion. It's a traditional industry. There's a lot of work still to be done in that industry. Oh, Betsy, great question real quick. Please define cisgender. I'm sorry, I did not define that before. Cisgender is someone who's not transgender. So someone who, I'm cisgender because the gender that the doctor decided I was at birth is the gender that I stuck with, right? So the doctor, when I was born, said, it's a girl, and I'm still a woman. So that's cisgender.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Bernadette, let's talk about your upcoming book, Unassuming Assumptions. Let's talk about the title first. That's very intriguing. What do you mean by that? And then let's talk a little about your book.
Yeah, so I really believe that we spend most of our time making assumptions as we walk through the world. And those assumptions are shortcuts. They're the way our brain is programmed to help us make quicker decisions, to help us move through the world, keep us safe. The amygdala of our brain, the fight, flight, or freeze part of our brain has been historically designed or programmed essentially to help us make really quick decisions. And so it categorizes similar things and similar types of people for shortcuts, for easy recall. But because of those shortcuts, that easy recall can actually cause us to make assumptions rather than seeing the full picture. So the trick here is to unassume assumptions so that you can get a better picture on how to be more inclusive of your diverse coworkers and team members, employees, to be more inclusive of your diverse clients and customers. And by asking better questions, we can unassume assumptions. And how do we ask better questions? We ask better questions through the ARC method. So the ARC method is the concept I talk a lot about in my book. And I put the link up earlier in the chat if you'd like to download the ARC cheat sheet.
Perfect. And Bernadette, when will your book be available and how can we get it?
All right, so I'm going to be vulnerable here. Anything goes, right? It's all good. So I started working on my book. I started working on my first version of the book probably 2 years ago. Got to about 29,000 words. Came to a screeching halt. Rethought the whole thing. Then basically shelved it for a while. Picked it back up pre-COVID. got probably another 10,000 words, like restructured it. Then I ignored it for 6 months. And the new reality of our world with COVID, too many other priorities, competing priorities. And a few weeks ago, I picked it back up, and I reworked it again. But my goal is to have it editor ready by October 1st, which it will be. And then I think it should be on shelves by January. That's the goal.
That's exciting. We'll look forward to sharing that when it's available.
Thank you. I'm excited. I mean, writing a book is a huge undertaking. There's lots of opportunity for imposter syndrome and second guessing and all of that. It is truly a labor of love, but I'm in a good flow now.
Awesome. Well, we're excited to be able to read that. All right. I think we're going to transition and take some questions from the Q&A. Let's start with, when introducing yourself, can your pronouns highlight what you label your race is? Let's see. So whoever, if you want to respond in the chat to clarify that question, can your pronouns highlight what you label your race is?
Or if you want to ask again and stay anonymous, maybe a little bit clarify.
Yeah, we need a little clarification on that one.
Yep.
Are there any non-binary terms for niece and nephew?
That's a great question. And the one that I have heard, I haven't heard it very much, but I have heard nibbling.
Okay.
Nibling is the non-binary term for niece and nephew.
Oh, that's awesome. Thanks.
Yep.
Is it okay to use a gendered greeting for someone whose gender you know, even if others will hear?
I would encourage you not to, because then we don't take the time to pause and think, right? So the more you can program yourself so that where the default is always inclusive rather than picking and choosing, the more successful you're going to be all of the time.
Awesome. Do you think we should ask for pronouns in recruitment screening calls, or should this come later on in the recruitment process?
That's a great question. I would not ask. It's a great question. I wouldn't ask their pronoun just by like straight up asking. I would share your pronoun and, do it the same way we practice it. I think that that's always a good best practice. And it also shows how progressive you are and how progressive the organization is. And we're talking about an entire generation of folks whose top priority in the workplace is inclusion and a great culture. Mm-hmm. And the more you can prove to folks who are candidates to work with your organization that you want, that your place of work is an inclusive, open, diverse place, the more successful you're going to be in getting great candidates. So I would say absolutely share your pronoun and then ask theirs. You practice it.
Absolutely. Bernadette, can you talk about addressing business correspondence, like Dear Mr. Blank or Dear Miss Blank?
That's a great question. So I would say, certainly the best practice here, if you have to use a title, would be to use mix, MX. But I think we're moving away from that kind of formality in general. Mm-hmm. Right? I think we're moving away from, especially there are lots of industries, maybe not finance, maybe not legal, but we're moving away from that type of formality in many other industries. But the best practice would be to use mix.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I think we got some clarification on that first question as far as identifying African American versus Black or white versus Caucasian. This has been a question in the workplace. So African American and Black, what's the best practice there, in your opinion? And I can.
I mean, unless you know that someone is African American, I always use Black. I learned that a while ago when I was working with teenagers at a YWCA in my early 20s. And these teenagers were like, I'm not African American, I'm Haitian.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so they schooled me.
That's right. You can't assume that someone is African American, because if you're speaking to someone who's African or someone who's Afro-Caribbean, right,
Mm-hmm.
they're not African American. And so Black is actually more of an inclusive term.
That's right.
Perfect.
That's right. Or, in some cases you can use BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color, depending on the context.
Absolutely. So we have a follow-up question on the Mr. or Mrs., but I think we addressed that in the MX. Mr. or Mrs. pronouns are they, them. Do you just address by first name or leave off the name?
I would leave off a title. I would say first, I mean, if it's a formal email and you know that their pronouns are they, them, then maybe say mix. But if it's not a formal email, then I would leave off any sort of honorific.
Awesome. So we just got a question around the term person of color and found that some people find that offensive while others don't care. How do you avoid missteps with terms that you're using? And this is a good general question.
I think, in general, it's ideal to know who you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
right? Is my best friend Asian or is she Korean? I mean, she's Korean, right? So I happen to know that level of specificity. And I think if we happen to know that level of specificity, that's what we should use. But I think for the broader context, then person of color or BIPOC works well. But here's the thing. None of us are ever going to get this perfect. We're going to mess up from time to time. There are going to be people who are offended despite our best efforts. Okay. And it's just the way it happens. And so all we can do is do our best, learn, and move on. Don't get offended by their offense, And I'm not saying, your intention might not equal your impact, and the impact is what matters. But at the same time, I do think that it's important to just try, learn, and move on.
That's right. Bernadette, that's such a good point. We're not always going to get it right. And that's, a rule of inclusive language, but you have to be, gracious with yourself and gracious with other people, knowing that they are moving in a direction and moving forward and trying to learn and trying to get it right. And we just have to, be easy with each other and with ourselves.
Absolutely. I totally agree.
So there's a question in the chat about referring to the author Glennon Doyle and how she talks about choosing her wife after being married to a man. So the question is, if someone has chosen to be gay or trans, can we be accepting of that? And so I wanted to address that question.
Yeah, I think, Brooke, it's a great question. I think this is kind of just a matter of like nuance. So of course, we can choose, we should accept everyone, however they identify, whatever their word choice is, we should just accept it. We shouldn't challenge it. You know, and I think that I also read Untamed. And I think it's just about the way that Glennon was talking about meeting Abby and how they got together. I read it as, you know, not that she was like choosing to not be straight, but she was choosing to totally upend her life, you know? So it was bigger than just a sexuality. It was like a revolution in her entire life that she was choosing. So that's how I interpreted it. But I think in general, yeah, I mean, when we ask good questions and listen to what people say. That's the respect part of the arc, is really truly listen and then take action.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bernadette. Another question that we've got here is using other as an option in gender questions on forms. So male, female, and other can be considered offensive. What are your thoughts on that? Because it does sound like a deviation from the norm.
I actually disagree with that, because there are so many gender options, and I think that for the purposes of collecting information, it can be really hard to present, you know, 50 different gender options. If you look at what Facebook did a few years ago, they allowed folks to customize their gender, and they started by having male, female, and then like 53 options. Cis male, cis female, bi, well, all these different choices, right? And so they did that for about a year, and then Facebook updated it again, and now it's male, female, blank, or male, female, custom. And if it's custom, it's just like blank box, infinite genders, because it's really hard to put people in a box, and we should try not to. And so I think that other is appropriate.
Got it. Thank you. How can you challenge someone who says they have no bias toward other genders or races, in particular when they say because they're part of a minority group, so they can't be biased? What are your thoughts there?
I mean, I can certainly tell stories from my life, so that would be part of my response, but I would actually use the ARC method in this case. I would use the ARC method to ask them further questions, like, can you tell me a little bit more by what you mean that you have no bias? What does that look like? You know, I think that you start asking more questions, and then you can have a deeper conversation to get some better perspective. So use the ARC method to really dig a little bit deeper in that. And I'll put the link again in the chat.
And there's a question in the chat, actually. What's the best way to identify yourself as an ally beyond the ARC method? And how
I think the best way, first of all, you know, being an ally is probably the most singularly important thing any of us can do, to use our advantages to help others, to use our advantages to lift others up. And so being an ally is truly about using your voice. It's truly about being aware of all of the different ways you can be inclusive. Being an ally means being proactively anti-racist. And I think that that's, you know, there's lots of ways that you can be a successful ally, but those are some of the ones that I think are going to be big wins for you, is to just think about all of the different ways that you can be inclusive of the diversity of your community, and just be really proactive and intentional about it, because being an ally does not happen by accident. You have to be really, really intentional about it.
That's right.
But that question also related to psychological safety. And I wanted to address that piece because I think that's a little bit different. Psychological safety starts with leadership. And when leaders talk about what's going on in their own lives, and when leaders get a little bit vulnerable and they show up authentically, that is an incredibly powerful way to create psychological safety in the organization. When leaders share their failures, right? When leaders share their losses and their stressors, that could have to do with work or maybe not. Maybe it's about something else that's going on in life. As a caregiver, as a parent trying to balance all of this stuff, we are all under stress. And as leaders, the more we can do to just be honest about that, authentic about that, and then give our team permission to do the same, that is incredibly powerful to creating psychological safety.
Absolutely. Well, as we begin to wind down, I wanted to share that the diversity movement has written a white paper called Say This, Not That, A Guide to Inclusive Language, that details categories of diversity with specific language around common terms and their inclusive alternatives. And it also includes some glossary terms as well. So that's free to download at thediversitymovement.com/publications. And Bernadette, as we begin to wind down, what would you like to leave us with today?
My biggest takeaway is don't make assumptions. That's really it, is like, think about all of the assumptions you make going through life that could potentially accidentally exclude folks, and also mean that you don't see the full picture. You don't see everyone's unique gifts. When we're making assumptions about someone's talents, when we're making some assumptions about someone's ability to do the job, then that's where unconscious bias comes in, right? I've talked about assumptions, but the reality is that assumptions can lead to unconscious bias. And I'm sure you're all probably pretty familiar with unconscious bias, but essentially assumptions are another form of that. And it shows up all throughout human resources. We're making assumptions about someone's ability to be promoted, someone's ability as a new mom to get the job done, someone's ability as a person with a disability to step up, or someone's ability as a person with autism, right? We're making assumptions about people's talents based on this one element of who they are. And it's just not fair. Like, we got to give people a fair shot. We don't want people making assumptions about us.
That's right. Well,
Yeah,
Bernadette,
all the time.
Thank you so much for your time today. I've, as always, enjoyed our conversation, and it's been so insightful and so many amazing tips and strategies. So thank you again. And thank you to everyone that participated on this webinar, for the amazing comments in the chat and the great questions that we got. If we did not get to your question, apologies. We'll try to answer it offline in some of the in the follow-up email that we send. But thank you all so much. Bernadette, always good to see you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity to speak with everyone. Great turnout, awesome engagement. Look at all the comments in the chat coming in now. Like, thank you all. I'm so glad this was useful. Really, the feedback, it lifts me up, keeps me going, and hopefully it keeps you going as well. So thank you for the opportunity.
All right, thank you so much. Everyone have a wonderful day.
All right, take care, everyone. Bye.